Hello and welcome to Esther's Gardening Adventures. I'm Esther, and today I'm going to talk about the things I do or my tips for handling this summer heat and just the fact that around this time of year it's just so easy to get overwhelmed with the garden. Right now it's 96 degrees outside and I'm sitting in the shade, and boy am I glad I am. It is so hot today. There's a lot of places that are getting heat waves. This video is not about how to protect your plants. It's about how to take care of yourself and still stay engaged and enjoy the garden. There's just some of the things that I've learned over the last few years that I thought I'd share with you. There are people who are experiencing fatigue and mid-garden overwhelm. Not only is it hot, but the weeds are out of control, or it's getting to the time of year when you have to actually start doing stuff with your produce, which can also be overwhelming. So the first lesson I've learned, or the first tip I have, is to go out in the garden in the early morning, or at least before midday, or in the evening. So if you look at the temperature, something I learned when I started gardening is that I paid attention to what the temperatures were at what time of day. Here in Maryland, zone 7 a.m., the coldest part of the day, the coolest part of any day, is right when the sun is rising, because it's been the longest amount of time without any sunlight to warm the earth that you're at. So the coolest part of the day is actually always in the morning. And that also means, like, when you have a freeze, that's when the freeze is the worst, but all that stuff. So basically the first hour after the sun comes up is really your coolest part of the day. And then about every hour, it's about 4 to 6 degrees that it increases, at least during the summer here. So this morning I went out at 7:30 and it was 74 degrees. And by the time I came home at 8:30, it was 82 degrees. So, and I was sweating, I was overheated, but I had to water my garden because we haven't had rain for more than a week. And the plants weren't looking stressed yet, but I knew that I needed to take care of that. So I got up a little earlier than normal to take care of that. All right, so that's tip number 1, is go in the morning or in the evening if you can. Tip number 2 applies to where I'm sitting now: shade, the importance of shade. So pay attention in your garden for which parts of the garden are shaded at which times of the day. And you can plan whatever you need to do, whatever is the most important thing you need to do for your garden. You can go out to that area when it's shaded, if you're able to go out during that time. So for me right now at 6 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday, the maple tree in our front yard, the Japanese maple tree in our front yard, actually provides a little bit of sun, a little bit of shade right under it, and that's how I can sit here and not be overheated. I'm already getting more pink just sitting here from the heat, but it's how I can be here tolerating it. And so just pay attention to that and try to take advantage of shade. You can also use manufactured shade. You can use umbrellas. So I bought, and I'll show you a shot of it, but I bought an umbrella that'll attach to a folding chair that, you clamp it onto a folding chair, and it allows you to create shade wherever you are located. And this is really helpful because I may not sit in the chair, but I'll actually take the chair and move it along as I'm sitting on a little stool in the garden to give me shade wherever I'm working, so that I can still work till midday if I'm running late in the morning, or I just don't have time and I need to get out there and harvest some fruit or vegetables. Tip number 3, and I think if you're going to be in a garden that's right outside of your house, you can just take a couple steps to get back indoors. You don't have to do this, although it's still a good idea, which is to stay hydrated. When I go to my community garden rental plot, I take a thermos of cold water, or I'll even just fill a mason jar with cold water, and I will keep it in a shaded area or cover it with something to help it stay cooler, and I will drink it. And boy, is that a good thing to make sure you don't get overheated, to make sure you stay hydrated, to help refresh you. Yeah, it's nothing like a glass of cold water in the middle of your garden heat. And basically when I run out of water in my bottle, that's when it's a signal and it's time to go back to the house. Sometimes I run out fast, sometimes it takes a little longer. It depends on the day. Number 4, and I think this has more to do with the overwhelm part, so more than the heated part, is prioritize your time. It's easy to feel overwhelmed because there's so much to do in your garden. But if you think about it, at this stage, there's really 2 things, maybe 3, but 2 things you really need to worry about. One is your garden getting enough water, right? So if it needs to be watered, that needs to be a priority. And I would say equally important, or maybe even the water can hold off if you can do this other thing first and then come back in the evening and do the other, which is to harvest your produce, especially for tomatoes. If you can harvest them before they're fully ripe, so you can let them sit on a shelf and fully mature, or you harvest tomatoes before, if they fully mature and they sit on the vine, they'll get mealy or they're mushy or they'll rot. So you want to get out there and harvest your produce as often as you can, even if it's just stepping outside for 10 minutes just to take a basket with you and just harvest some produce. Also, harvesting produce while in the heat doesn't feel fun. It is quite rewarding, and it's why you garden, which actually leads me to my next point, which is remember why you started doing this in the first place. I've heard other gardeners and other people who take on big new projects say that when the going gets hard, if you can remember back to when you yearned for this, for when you yearned to have a garden to go into, for when you were craving to have this fresh, delicious tomatoes or peppers or zucchini or squash, although mine are already dead. My zucchini plants are dead by now. But if you can remember what drove you, what that passion was deep inside of you, and you can tap into that, that can help you go outside for an extra 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, or even just step out the door to get a little bit of work done in your garden. And really, it's okay if you don't get everything done. Just try to get out to the garden and get a little bit, even if it's 5 minutes of time. Try to get out there and get something done. And while you're out there, and this is like a bonus tip, I guess, which is try to take photos. It's easy when it's overheated and you're overwhelmed to not take photos, but this is when your garden is actually producing the most fruit, the most flowers, when even though it's chaotic, there are little snippets of beauty. So try to take a photo, try to take a minute, especially if you can go in the evening and sit in the shade, or in the morning with a cool glass of water or an iced tea, and just sit and absorb your garden for a few minutes. Give yourself the space to enjoy it, because this is why you're doing this. Even though it's overwhelming, it's worth it. This morning, I saw a skink. This morning, I saw a skink in my wheelbarrow that's filled up with a little bit of water. I'll show you a clip here. And I got to watch him, and then I put in a little stick to help him get out. And I went back this morning, and he's gotten out. So that's awesome. And I wouldn't have noticed him in that little wheelbarrow with water if I hadn't just sat there for a minute and let myself relax and cool down a little bit instead of just push. So give yourself a minute to enjoy your garden. And lastly, I'll say it's okay if you don't do everything right, if you can't get to the crop, if you can't harvest a crop, if you can't get out there and water. Be kind to yourself. Don't make this a guilt-driven thing. We all have to let something drop at this time of year. We all have to let something fail or not weed or do whatever it takes to keep going and keep enjoying the garden. So don't let yourself be judgmental on yourself. Give yourself permission to not go as hard at gardening if you need to. It's okay. The garden will be there, and as many gardeners say, there's always next year. So, take that to heart. And then the last little thing, I know I said that other thing was last, but the last little thing is, if you're outside watering your garden and you find yourself being overheated, and let's say you finished all your water, there's a couple of pulse points in your body that if you can get some cool water running, a ice pack, or if you come back in the house and you're overheated with ice pack, or a cool washcloth, there are a couple pulse points in your body. And I learned this was in Utah, and the bride got overheated, passed out, and there were some EMTs there, and they put a cold pack of ice on the back of her neck, which is where it cools your body, one of the big pulse points. Also, the EMT told me that your wrists, this part of your wrist, just putting a cold pack or cold water to your wrist can help cool your body. And a lot of times when I'm watering my garden, even if it's not cold water, just the act of pouring some water over my wrist as I'm watering the garden will help me cool down a little bit. Other pulse points include your armpits. Now that's not very sexy, but if you really need it, put something on your armpits to cool off, or maybe even just go inside and rinse off your armpits. And I had who's now passed, an Aunt Nellie, who taught us that when you're really overheated or you need to feel refreshed, to go inside, rinse your pits, wipe off your thighs, kind of rinse your legs a little bit, and you will feel so much more refreshed. So those are a couple of things, not the sexiest things. Those are a couple, and maybe even rinse your face, you know, splash your face with some cool water. Sometimes I'll even just put my face in the sink, just sit in the water to cool down. And those things can help you cool down, help you avoid being overheated, and help you not feel so reluctant perhaps to go outside, because you know there's ways you can cool down. And of course, making a nice ice popsicle or having a nice glass of something cool, watermelon to eat or something in the house also helps. So I hope these tips, you found them helpful, useful, and yeah, share what tips you have, because I think there's, you know, it's easy to get discouraged, but I think there are sort of tricks and tools that can make it more manageable. And I hope you're having a great week. See you next time, and happy gardening.